Good morning and welcome to the Corporate Scrutiny Panel meeting. My name's Councillor John Taylor and I chair this committee. I'll start by asking the other members of the panel to briefly introduce.
Good morning everyone, I'm Councillor Alex Lukic from Dewsbury East Ward.
Councillor Harry McCarthy from Colne Valley Ward.
I think we have online. Maybe not.
Thanks, Councillor Paul Davies.
And we also have an observer, if they'd like to introduce themselves.
I don't know if you can hear me, John, but the executive governance is muted, so I can't hear you. So I'm seeing you talking and looking up at the screen and just assuming that that's sort of me you're asking about.
Right, can you not hear us then, Tyler? Clearly not. Oh, that's not going to be very good.
No, I definitely can't hear you, sorry.
We have apologies from Councillor Hall, Councillor Lawson and Christina Parks.
Thank you. Next item 2 on the agenda is minutes of the previous meeting. Are members happy with the minutes of the meeting held on the 28th of November? Yeah, we're okay to accept those. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Agenda item 3. Councillors are asked to mention if there are any items on the agenda for which they have a disclosable pecuniary interest. If you do, please indicate now. Take that as a no. If during the discussion it comes to light that you do, there is a form in the pack. If you could provide, fill that in and provide it to Jenny at the end of the meeting. Thank you. Item 4, admission of the public.
There is an item to exclude the public, Chair, so the panel will need to resolve at agenda item 10 whether the public should be excluded at that point.
Okay, we'll pick that up later on.
Just to point out that I think executive governance is on mute on Teams, and that's why Tyler can't hear. So if you just, yeah.
Tyler, can you hear us now?
Yes, John. Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you. We've just been joined by Gary, who is our co-optee. Gary, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself. You're on mute, Gary.
Yeah, my name's Gary Kitchen. I'm a volunteer co-optee.
Thank you. We're just on, just going through the agenda. We've just done admissions of the public, agenda item 4. We're on to agenda item 5. Deputations and petitions. Have we received any?
None received, Chair.
Thank you. Agenda item 6, public question time. I'm assuming that's a no as well. Thank you. We're swiftly moving through the agenda. We're now on to item 7, which is the Council Finance Update. And I think Eamon's going to introduce this item. So I'll hand the floor to you, Eamon.
Thank you, Chair. So just to introduce myself this morning, my name's Eamon Croston. I'm Service Director for Finance for Kirklees Council. So there's a paper on the agenda this morning. It's financial update, Council Financial Update. It's one of a series of updates which were brought through the year to Corporate Scrutiny Panel. And in particular, it's reflecting on the outcome of the provisional financial settlement, along with other key budget developments in terms of reviewing our spend and funding assumptions and where we think we're kind of at with our budget gap position compared to what we reported in the September 23-24 medium-term financial strategy update, and this is pending budget proposals subsequently coming forward from the administration, ultimately to be presented to Budget Council on the 8th of March. We'll also give a bit of an update in terms of the emerging in-year position as well. Okay, so I thought I'd do a bit of a quick recap, quick being relative when I'm speaking, of course, but so as we said previously through the year, our in-year position and our budget cap position for 23-24 has been heavily influenced by a range of cost of living kind of crisis pressures, and also acknowledging that when we set the budget in February, as we tend to do when we're looking further ahead beyond just the next financial year, we tend to start with a bit of a budget gap in terms of our forward plan, spend and funding forecast. So we had a pre-existing budget gap of 16 million in 23-24, and that was before the challenges, the quite significant additional challenges impacted on us by cost of living pressures. So we took a report in September, MTFS update report, where we revised our budget gap assumptions to 41 million from 16 million, heavily influenced particularly by energy price review and also the actual pay award for 22-23, which would wash forward into 23-24 being considerably higher than we'd budgeted for in our February budget plans. It was around about 7.6% average uplift for council staff compared to the 2% we'd assumed. And again, that uplift heavily influenced by sort of broader cost of living pressures and impacting on wage inflation as well across all sectors. So we'd also presented a Q2 monitoring report, financial monitoring report, which was reflecting a 34 million in-year overspend on general fund, which was just equivalent to about just under 10% of our net general fund revenue position, a 335 million budget. And as part of that Q2 report, we'd set ourselves a minimum overspend reduction target of 4 million to year end, including a number of additional management actions, which we'll come on to later in terms of progress against that. And I would say this, I hope we exceed that by year end, because it will certainly help in terms of putting funding back into our reserves. So we also recognise as well that we had an accelerated, shall we say, unplanned drawdown on reserves in year compared to what we planned for in February. And we'd already highlighted an extra 10 million that we transferred from usable reserve into unallocated reserves to support our in-year position. And obviously, depending on what the year-end position is on general fund, that will draw down more of our available reserves as well. But we recognise that and we'll obviously factor that into our future plans as well. Then we had the autumn statement announcement on 17th November, and I know came back to Corporate Scrutiny panel on the 28th November and did a bit of a brief presentation. Update then. I've kind of factored into the narrative of the paper that I presented this morning for the record, the key points from that autumn statement presentation as impacts on us. So we'd identified at the time that in headline terms, government was indicating they were going to put extra resources into local government, particularly around social care, extra resources into schools, extra resources into the NHS, etc. So we were anticipating then what would that translate to in terms of individual council funding allocations. So we were obviously waiting on the provisional financial settlement, which would have that detail. That was announced on the 19th of December, and I'll come back to that in a minute in terms of what it means for us. Government also announced a number of measures which we clocked at the last Corporate Scrutiny panel meeting around additional support to households and businesses impacted on by cost of living that would wash through into 23-24 as well. So state pension benefits were uprated by the September CPI 22 rate, which was 10.1%, so that will be effective from April next year, because we knew there's some speculation nationally as to what those up rates would be, and we know as well we're getting some additional housing support funding grant, which is supporting vulnerable households with cost of living pressures, household bills and the like. And that will continue into 23-24. We're still waiting for what our share of that will be. Government hasn't finalised yet. They talked about £1 billion across the UK, but it's similar to what they put in 22-23, so we reckon our share of that will be around about 7.4 million, subject to confirmation from government. So as we knew as well, alongside that, there was so as part of the autumn statement, there was an updated Office of Budget Responsibility forecast predicting a gradual reduction in CPI and RPI over the next 2 years, prospect of a global recession at least over the next 12 months or so, and a corresponding increase potentially in the unemployment rates, but then getting back at some point in the future to kind of nearer the targets that had been previously assumed, around 2% inflation, etc. But some of that is quite, still remains reasonably, quite volatile in terms of the global situation and factors outside our control, but would have impacts on us. Government also published a policy document on the 12th of December as a precursor to the provisional financial settlement, noting, and in that document, it was just setting out their context for the settlement, noted that a number of councils had built up their reserves position over 2 years of the pandemic. So government was expecting councils to start using their reserves levels built up through the pandemic to maintain services in light of immediate inflationary pressures, whilst taking account of the need to maintain appropriate levels of reserves to support councils' financial sustainability and future investment. So that was kind of the government's take in terms of the overall sectoral build-up of reserves. It's kind of interesting observation because, yes, that probably has happened. But when you have increased uncertainty around some of the volatility, particularly external volatility, that can impact on organisations' financial situations, it's actually prudent for councils or other organisations to try and build up reserves through that period as well, where there's less predictability about some of the pressures coming through. So you can look at it different ways. But the other point to note as well is it's not as if councils are acting on a level playing field. When you look at across the sector, different councils will have different levels of reserves provisions and different levels of expectations themselves about what they would have built up through the pandemic years. So it's just recognising that there's a wide breadth of what reserves councils have available at an individual level to support some of those immediate cost pressures as well. We're not all coming at it from the same starting point, but clearly, we have to acknowledge that that's the government expectation. And as we're going through the remainder of this year, and in terms of our forward plans, we do acknowledge that our contribution to government expectation is reducing our reserves levels, and clearly we're putting in place measures to ensure that we, as far as we can, still have an adequate level of reserves. And we'll come on to that as well in terms of the other item on the agenda later today about our corporate risk register and risk review, as well as what it means in terms of sustainability and resilience going forward in light of those government expectations. So the government announcement that came through on the 19th of December, there was a headline national cash increase of 9.2%. So there's a summary table in the report that sets out all the various funding sources that make up the government funding allocation to councils. So the headline expectation was the headline figure was an average of 9.2% cash increase, comparing the 22-23 funding allocation to the 23-24. Our specific funding allocation was equivalent to about 9.6%, so it's slightly above the national average, and that's reasonably consistent when you look at councils in the region. You have West Yorkshire councils. So in cash terms, that amounts to about a 34 million increase, albeit on quite a large figure to start with. But we'd anticipated, and this is set out in the paper this morning, we kind of anticipated a fair amount of that anyway in our existing plans. So it's not as if it all came as a big surprise to us. Probably about 2/3 of it we'd already anticipated in terms of funding growth for social care pressures, and also what government puts in its headline figures is an expectation about what councils will uplift their council tax, including the adult social care precept by in the following year. So, for example, in these figures, it kind of expects or anticipates that councils up and down the land would increase their or maximise their council tax uplift by the allowable threshold rate, which for councils with social care responsibilities, the headline uplift is 5%. So that's reflected in these headlines, but clearly it's obviously a matter of consideration at an individual council level, ultimately through their annual budget councils, as to what they're prepared to uplift council tax by annually to support the pressures on the bottom line. But, okay, so that's a bit of background as to where we're at. So I'm just going to pause for a second and then come back at it in terms of what it means, just to give myself a little bit of breathing space as well. So what does all that mean in terms of our updated spend and funding assumptions then? Because the reference point we've got at the moment for general fund is we had a 41 million budget gap in September. So what has or hasn't changed? So it's probably first reflecting on where we're at in terms of energy prices, which is obviously topical and continues to be topical. So the pressure on energy prices is still significant. But going back to the corporate scrutiny panel meeting on the 28th of November, we did say then, or put a bit of a marker, that at that point where global prices were going was indicating that actually the headline pressure we had in to arrive at the budget gap of 41 million, the energy price pressure was continuing to escalate, and we were concerned that actually our energy price assumptions weren't likely covering the further pressures on top of that 41 million. But we've reined back from that since. So even in the last couple of months, you'll have picked up that wholesale energy costs are coming down globally. When I say they're coming down, the rate of increase from where we were is coming down. They're still increasing significantly, but they're much nearer to the predictions we had in the September report uplift for energy costs, rather than what we were more concerned about following that report, that actually things might get appreciably worse. So it's kind of good news in that they're coming down, but still significantly higher than they had been when we set the budget in February. And that is still an area of volatility. You know, we've got to put a line in the sand at some point in terms of where our budget, what we agree is a budget for 23-24, but obviously we'll continue to review that as we go through 23-24 and 24, obviously a precursor to 24-25. You'll have picked up as well that government have now set out its plans for continued support, not just for a price cap for household energy bills for 23-24, but it had said that it was reviewing non-domestic customers as well, and they've now set out their plans for 23-24 for non-domestic customers. So not as generous as it was in 22-23, but in effect what government have also done is had a look at what those energy prices are in 23-24 and pitched their support accordingly. So they've come up with set proposals for energy and gas around putting a kind of cap in terms of energy and gas costs. They had hinted before Christmas that public sector wouldn't be included as part of that energy support for 23-24, but I think in light of global energy prices coming down, their expectations as to what the call on government might be from the extra support is not as high as they were anticipating before Christmas. So they've opened the door again to public sector organisations, including charities. But they have said that the additional support won't necessarily apply to sports centres and swimming pools, so I'm not quite sure why. So there's obviously a lot of lobbying still going on around that in terms of trying to get to the bottom of that from the sector. And obviously, councils either directly provide swimming pools or sports centres as well, or is provided through a third party, as in our case. So we're trying to get to the bottom of that, and what we're trying to do as well is, in conjunction with Crown Commercial Services, who will be brokering our electricity contract from 23-24, and YPO, Yorkshire Purchasing Organisation, we're part of a consortium of member authorities with them, who broker our gas contract for 23-24. They're looking at an individual council basis now what the potential impact of that additional support may be. So I haven't factored anything yet into our updated budget position assumptions around that until we get that modelled analysis. It's probably more likely going to support us on gas and electricity, just in light of where the caps are at, if there is some extra support. So that's still a work in progress in the background that we're looking at around that. You might be picked up in the national news this morning as well. Again, these things are hot off the press, isn't it? You know, you Google search BBC News, or if you're listening to the radio, that there was, depending who you listen to, but an expectation that global energy prices are not likely to come down to pre-COVID levels. They might stabilise, they might chip away slightly, but they're not likely to come down to that kind of level of energy price. So that's just something we need to clock going forward as well. So while we're not just predicting 23-24, looking beyond that, there might be some marginal further reductions in the predicted uplift in energy prices, but we just, I think, probably need to accept that in time, then in a number of areas, things aren't going to come down back to pre-COVID levels, and that is just one area as well. So I've hinted about the summary table that's in the financial update. That there's quite a lot in there, probably about 2/3 that we'd already predicted. As tends to happen, where you've got a number of funding sources listed and you compare one year with the other, some are up, some are down. In terms of the net impact, kind of look on the bottom line. But most of that net growth is positively impacting on in terms of social care funding, which is a combination of direct grant award. Some of that additional grant will have conditions because it's tied into things like supporting hospital discharge. Some of it is being allocated through the West Yorkshire Integrated Care Board. So, you know, it's coming through funding pots where we're working in collaboration with health partners, so there needs to be discussion about that. And some of that funding as well, it's not all about adult social care, there's pressures on children's services as well. And we also have to recognise that in light of the national living wage uplift, which was approved by government for 23-24, there'll be some element of that national living wage uplift, that 9.7%, which was above what councils would have predicted, certainly what we predicted, will be passed on through fee rates to care providers as well, subject to negotiation. So while we haven't budgeted for some of that social care fund increase, there'll be unbudgeted pressures as well in the system that we hadn't factored into our existing plans, but there still might be some wiggle room on the overall bottom line that we're considering at the moment, and that's in conjunction with continuing to review our demand assumptions anyway in our plans around children's and adults and elsewhere, and you know how much risk appetite we're putting into the system, and how much do we think in conjunction with health colleagues we can collaboratively fund from other sources as well. So we haven't nailed that completely, but there's potential some wiggle room to put some resourcing back in to support some of our pre-existing funding pressures that we already had in our MTFP around social care. So I suppose what I'm saying overall is that when you look at that totality of 34 million, which also assumes that councils like us will take the full 5% council tax and adult social care precept uplift. It's kind of de-risking some of the pressures we thought might come through, where we'd had some funding assumptions for social care. So in a sense, government is committed to putting that support into the system for next year, and more besides, because there was concerted lobbying by government before the financial by a number of councils before the local government financial settlement, particularly about the social care situation. So we're also going back to the September report as well. So when we were updating our budget gap assumptions in September, we already had in view schools transport pressure coming through. So we'd already said then that we'd put extra funding into base for schools transport. And since then, looking at Q2 monitoring, while a lot of the pressure, budget pressure coming through is around cost of living, there are other pressures coming through within directorates as well, other service pressures. So again, we've looked at that, and some of that service pressure will be reflected in the updated budget position as well by the time we finalise where we're at. So we're looking at things as well like inflationary pressures on insurance premium, for example, council insurance premium. We're looking at our housing subsidy position. So we administer a range of housing benefits to private and council tenants on behalf of government, and we get funding back from government to support those pressures. We've obviously got continuing pressures on homelessness demands and preventing homelessness. So some of the accommodation that we use, in particularly temporary accommodation, around things like particular types of temporary accommodation, for example, bed and breakfast, if we utilise that kind of accommodation for any length of time, then government actually puts some performance disincentives into the amount that they pay back for the amount of housing benefit we've paid out. And that's kind of an underlying pressure that we're now reflecting. But no doubt some of the budget officers and administration will be looking at what can we do to mitigate some of those pressures in terms of type of accommodation going forward. So we've also done a corporate capital plan review. Keep saying that will come through in the budget as well in terms of how that's impacting, but that will have an impact in terms of our Treasury management budget assumptions going forward compared to what we set out in the September MTFS update report. Just to note as well, and I will shut up in a minute, honestly, corporate capital, so there's a council tax base review as part of our annual review as well. So in addition to what the likely council tax increase is going to be, we also review what our council tax base position is for the following year. So there is a report going to Cabinet on the 17th of January. So we are predicting that the council tax base will increase for 23-24. I think it's just about 1,300 in terms of Band D equivalent. That's probably slightly less than the uplift we'd factored into our pre-existing budget plans when we were forward looking beyond just the current year when we set our plans in February. But there is potentially some mitigation for that, and we'll keep an open mind as to what's happening before in terms of 24, 25 and future years, of course. The HRA rent uplift, the 7%, has also gone through in the 21st of December Cabinet report, and the schools funding allocations for 23-24, our share of the extra 2.2 billion as well.
I'm kind of conscious of time.
Yeah, appreciate that.
I do want to let members have an opportunity to come in.
Of course, I've come to the end now in terms
can I
of
ask you to
sort of
bring it to a close?
context setting. Appreciate I've hogged the time a little bit. Thank you.
I'll open it then to members if anyone has any questions or comments to make. Come to you first, Alec.
Thank you, Chair. Eamon, you spoke about the government announcing more funding to councils, and obviously assuming councils will put up their council tax by a certain percentage, 5%, including when you include social care precepts as well. I was wondering, is the government this year offered any flexibilities in terms of deferring it, or does it have to be taken now, or it's kind of lost, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I know in previous years there has been that flexibility to actually profile the uplifts over a number of years, but that's not on offer, certainly not through the provisional financial settlement, mindful that the final, there's a consultation period of 4 weeks between the provisional settlement and the final settlement. So that closes on the 16th of January. So the final settlement will be announced sometime after that. I'm not picking up from the sector or from government that there's going to be some flexibility in that. I think this is what's on offer for next financial year. Take it or leave it, or a variant.
Thank you. I'll come to Councillor Hawkins online.
Thank you, John. Yeah, forgive my appearance. I'm a little under the weather at the moment, but thank you for that, Eamon, as well. I just want to sort of start with a little preamble before I get to my question, though, because I am aware, and I do want the message to be loud and clear to the public that this is affecting everyone. I think the latest one I've heard about with the sort of financial black hole, as they are dubbing it, is Cheshire East Council, I believe, is if that's correct. And there's every local authority, every local government organisation from Kirklees to Kensington are being affected by the sort of challenges we're facing. We're all in the same boat. It's just at the minute the boat feels a bit like the Titanic. Look, based on what's in the report that that's been presented, what you were discussing here, but as well, there are a number of assumptions in there that are expecting national government intervention or further national government intervention. We're expecting them to step in and sort of take the wheel and steer us away from the iceberg. Do we have any indication at the moment as to when we might hear more from national government on this? I'm just aware that we've got we've already delayed the council budget to March, I'm just aware that time is marching on, and we will need to get that information and pass a budget in not long. There's not long left to do that. So I'm just wondering if there's any expectations of when we're going to hear any more, or are we just holding our breath and hoping for the best in that sense? Thank you.
Okay, so what we do know, we've got the provisional settlement for 23-24, and government also put some indicative figures in for 24-25 as well, around further uplifts for things like social care funding. But these are all without prejudice, because government itself will be reviewing on an ongoing basis in light of national and international conditions what might happen for 24-25. I said earlier about the trying to work out what the implications of the further non-domestic energy support might mean for 23-24, and hopefully we'll have some of that over the next few weeks. I'm not anticipating government's going to change its mind on anything that was set out in the provisional settlement. So I think the figures, for example, the figures in this table, the figures around the thresholds, what government is allowing for council tax and social care uplift, and what that means in terms of any or no flexibility that we just discussed. I think those figures are fairly solid now. So I think on a number of things, we just have to take a view and draw a line in order to set the budget, and accept that there will still be, over the next 12 months, a review of some of those ongoing funding and spend assumptions in preparation for 24-25. I still expect there'll be lobbying across the local government sector as well. So I can't second guess or preempt what extra support or other things government might announce through 23-24. But we do know from experience as well that, in addition to whatever core funding allocations government are setting out across the various government departments, we get a whole plethora of ad hoc funding announcements as well that happens through the year, which may support us as well in different ways. So again, we'll be looking out for those in terms of, how can they help sustain or support our bottom line position, but also as well what it means in terms of helping us with some of our ambition, and quite a lot of that tends to be around regen, sort of capital side, but increasingly, for example, with what I hinted at with health colleagues as well, given some of the existential and ongoing pressures around the health, there tends to be funding announcements from government through the year as well around things like winter pressures, etc. So we'll be looking out for those as what opportunities it can, collectively bring us. But that's kind of where we're at the moment.
Thanks, Eamon. I'm going to bring Councillor Hawkins back in.
Well, thanks again, John. Thank you for that, Eamon, as well. Just one that this is probably more my ignorance of council finance than anything, this question, but I understand that we continue with the capital investments because, or the capital plan, should I say, because that's how capital finance works. So we're in a position to do that. But I'm also aware that when some of the external organisations that the council has been supporting and subsidising over a number of years, we're no longer, as a council, are no longer in a position to continue subsidising it. I'm thinking of Cal and of the stadium. I'm just wondering, that's not referenced in this. How was that changing of position due to the reality of the situation we're in? How has that affected the council's financial picture, pulling away from those subsidising external organisations like that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. So, clearly, you're absolutely right. We have a number of relationships with a number of external organisations, including CAL, KSDL. We also have a fairly significant relationship with West Yorkshire Metropolitan, Mayoral Combined Authorities, or Metropolitan, going back to 1974, as well. So it'd be useful to include that as well in the conversation. So we're obviously mindful of that, and obviously that will be taken into account as well in terms of what subsequent budget proposals go forward and what expectations there are in terms of what likely levels of support there might be going forward. There was a report there've been a number of reports around KSDL, one just before Christmas, so that report still holds, and that's party to an ongoing negotiation and actions that came from that particular report. So that's happening as I speak. So again, we'll be making provision for that in terms of our updated plans. So they are in view. All those things are in view. In terms, I just wanted to mention West Yorkshire I'm going to say it again, Mayoral Combined Authority. You're going to have to start finding me, because we also receive significant funding via government through the region as well. So while we're looking at support to external partners, which is obviously critical, there's also external funding support through the region as well, which is part of that debate. And I know you hinted, Councillor Hawkins, about capital plan review as well. So part of that capital plan review has come across strongly in terms of West Yorkshire Mayoral Combined Authority, in terms of their own budget position, but also in terms of reprofiling some of those major infrastructure projects as well. And I think a collective recognition about what perhaps had been assumed previously, where there were shifting sands in terms of updated projections around some of those major projects and grant-funded contributions from the region, about expectations about how much councils could underwrite the difference. So councils are now pushing back on that and saying, look, don't assume that councils can underwrite the difference and all those programmes can still go ahead. There still has to be a regional reprioritisation. So that's kind of in the mix as well. But that's probably where I just want to go to on that. So it's recognised, they're clocked, and it's part and parcel of the budget proposals and what we'd be prepared to support going forward. It'll all come out in the mix.
Thanks, Eamon. I do have some comments and questions myself, which I'll come to later. I just want to pick up on the KSDL and the CAL issue, really, because I think if I've understood it correctly, they're very different in terms of the nature, aren't they? And I think the KDSL is about getting the right contract and relationship, and probably that would have been happening even if we hadn't had these unprecedented, significant challenges this year, whereas probably CAL is more a consequence of the impacts that we're having this year. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry. Yeah, I was just... Sorry, before you come in, Councillor Davies. No, it's okay. I got there first. I apologise. No, no, you're absolutely right. The context for what we do, what our collective ambition is around, the shareholder ambition is around the stadium going forward has been there for a while. So that's always been in view from the council's point of view, and that remains a priority for us in terms of, what we're considering in terms of the council's position to support that direction of travel. And you're right, the CAL position has been particularly impacted. There's two major impacts for CAL because the pandemic impact has impacted across the leisure industry as elsewhere, and we have directed significant COVID funding provided by the council by government to support CAL with its post-pandemic recovery, and then the extra whammy of the energy price impact as well is also impacting on their bottom line.
Thank you. I'm just going to check. Is any? Yeah, you want to come in?
Thanks, Chair. Just on the CAL issue again, last week at a select committee meeting, they had some civil servants from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, and they were questioned on leisure centres and swimming pools, and the civil servants couldn't point to a strategy for maintaining them, and the civil servants weren't aware if they were having difficulties remaining financially sustainable. So it is a little bit baffling to me personally. This is more of a comment than a question, really. But a bit baffling to me personally, the fact that we've not got any support coming forward this past month. So now the question, it's just, what has been the effect of the management actions that we've taken so far? We announced some last year around recruitment freezes and building. So do you have any sort of figures or kind of any evidence as to what the effect has been so far?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, because I did put a marker in the report, didn't I, that we'd come on to that as well. So that's probably a useful segue. So you're right, we did have a number of further management actions that we set out at Q2, and we kind of had a headline aspirational figure to aim towards in terms of what might be possible. So we're still reviewing as we go through the remainder of the financial year how that impact is coming through, but we do know that in a number of instances, because we've put some additional internal corporate governance around recruitments that are coming through and being considered, and also through the various directorate senior management teams around how they're holding vacancy management between now and year end. Because I think the other thing to note when we did the Q2 monitoring report, because at that time it was about, I suppose, temporary measures at that time, pending what we were doing in terms of looking at the budget going forward between now and year end. So some of the measures around vacancies and looking at recruitment is about holding on or putting back when some of those recruitments will take place, to actually buy us some time for 22-23 to bring some of the overspends down. And some of it's around directorates looking at their existing vacancy management proposals and looking further ahead at those. So we're still kind of quantifying what those might be, but they are coming through for 22-23. So they will make inroads into that 4 million. There's some aspects of non-essential spend that we're looking at as well and continuing to look at. These things take time to actually come through the monitoring process, but undoubtedly they are starting to have an impact. We're starting to see some of those with some of the headline figures that we're reporting. Clearly some of the proposals around use of buildings and use of facilities, not just Cal, but some of our public buildings are actually being quantified as well, because we know we've kind of mothballed or reduced energy consumption across some of our key buildings as well for the remainder of the current financial year. So that's coming through as well. We have to recognise as well that while those things are coming through in some other areas, there may still be some demand pressures that we hadn't picked up at Q2, so that there will still be things potentially pushing in the other direction around particularly children's and adults. But overall, and I'll also put in the mix as well, where we've been reviewing the energy price impact from what's coming through, there's also been a little bit of a recalibration of our 22-23 assumptions purely in terms of the energy, the impact of energy prices for the current year as well and consumption. So we think at the moment with an amalgam of all those things together, we're on track certainly for the 4 million target. In terms of specifics, in terms of breaking it down, we're still looking at that, but certainly by the time we get to Q3 monitoring report, we'll have a more detailed breakdown of some of those mitigations, and we'll be able to put more of a quantification. But I'm reasonably assured at the moment that we are making inroads in those areas where we have some element of control. What I'm not sure about yet is some of the demand impacts which are still coming through between now and year end in some of those sort of key areas around social care.
Do you want to come back in?
Yeah, that's good to hear, because I know that other councils in West Yorkshire, Wakefield for example, has actually had to close its town halls, which we haven't had to make that decision. So if this is making an impact, that's, you know, positive that we don't have to make even more difficult decisions. I just hope as well you could just clarify. So it's on point 126 in the report where it says the relative difference between pre-provisional local government settlement and after effectively offsets the unbudgeted cost of living inflationary pressures across a range of adults and children's care provider costs. So the way that I take that to mean is sort of relative to before the local government financial settlement. The local government financial settlement sort of helps us deal with the cost of living pressures in adults' social care and children's social care, but we've still got this massive hole for every other part of our budget. Is that correct? But it's a bit ignorant about local government finance, so perhaps not expressed in the right way.
No, you've expressed it really well, to be honest. I think you're right. Government have obviously, I suppose, prioritised in terms of what they said in the autumn statement about a budget for stability. So particularly given the pressures around social care, you're absolutely right. It's kind of de-risking some of those cost of living pressures that are impacting across the social care provider sector. And clearly the government are also mindful of the interrelationship between health and social care, given all the other pressures that are impacting on the NHS at the moment. What I said earlier about government expectations around councils using reserves to cover off some of the other here and now pressures. So that would include the here and now pressures around other aspects of cost of living inflation permeating through other council budgets, and also as well around the energy impact in particular. The expectation is that it'll be kind of, we'll support you on social care, you support yourselves around on using your reserves that you've built up over the 2 years of the pandemic to support those other here and now pressures. But the thing about reserves is you use them once, don't you? Whereas what we don't know yet is how systemic or structural some of these other cost of living pressures are going forward. But as I said on energy, some of those are likely to be baked in, but maybe not to the extent we were predicting a few months ago.
Thanks, Eamon. Have you got any further?
One more following on from what you've just said. It's about reserves, because the way I kind of read that in a way is, well, you can use your reserves, but obviously a lot of councils just don't have the flexibility to use their reserves because they've not built up the same kind of position. So, I mean, for a start, do we have kind of the same level of flexibility as some councils to dip into our reserves? And would that be a responsible thing to do?
I mean, there's always a debate to be had about the adequacy of reserves, putting aside the specific pressures that councils are facing at the moment. I think we've had various conversations at Scrutiny and elsewhere about what is an appropriate level of reserves, and to some extent that ties into our corporate risk register as well, about some of the unbudgeted risks that are out there. Undoubtedly, it is going to put more strain on our own reserves position, so we have to ensure that whatever strategies we have going forward, we're absolutely clear what that means in terms of what our remaining reserves are likely to be, prioritise how we use those reserves, and I think as well as part of our medium-term strategy, particularly where we're using reserves to underwrite some areas of volatility where there's not necessarily that level of absolute predictability, be it prices or even second-guessing what the pay award might be in 23-24. We need to have that position as well that will take every opportunity to build those reserves back up as well through the year and through future years where we can, and look at that as a kind of a continuous process as well. So if we have to draw down more than we'd like to draw down to support, say, the budget proposal or budget plans for next year and the year after, that's predicated on using every opportunity to build those reserves back up again. That's what we'll have to do or consider.
Thanks, Eamon, and that segues nicely into one of my questions. If members are happy. And I'd like to deal with my questions in two chunks in a way, in that firstly, let's look at the in-year pressures. And I'm just trying to understand from our conversation so far today, when we looked at Q2, we were talking about 34 million in-year pressure, yet the only ambition we had was to look at saving £4 million over the second half of the year. So we were assuming that the other 30 million in-year pressure was going to be taken out of reserves. And just hold that thought for a second. Subsequent to that, we recalibrated our energy assumptions, but I don't know whether we recalibrated them up or down, but we recalibrated them. And certainly in terms of school transport, what we've seen since September is a significant fall off of petrol and diesel prices. So I'm assuming that has been factored in. So what I'm trying to understand is, we were talking 34 million, and the expectation was we'd take 30 million of that out of our reserves by the sounds of things. That doesn't sound as though we were perhaps being as ambitious as we ought to have been as an administration in terms of how we deal with those in-year pressures. And certainly the actions that have been taken, when we first talked about this back in September, October, we were talking about closing buildings. I know you said we haven't closed our town halls, but there were plans to close the town halls. I understood they were still in play, but nothing seems to have happened. So has there been the rigour and speed that we probably need to deal with a 10% increase in costs? Because certainly what we learned through the pandemic is this organisation has the ability to react and to pivot at speed when it needs to. But it doesn't feel as though we've done that in this circumstance, even though a 10% overspend is something that ought to be a flashing red light for the administration. So can I just clarify, one, have we recalibrated up or down the energy costs? Secondly, is it still our intention to take 30 million out of reserves this year, or has something else happened? And thirdly, is there still an ambitious plan to try and tackle the overspend? I've got other questions looking forward to next year, but if we can just deal with those first, please, if I may.
Okay, so just on energy prices then. So we'd factored in a number into the September MTFS update report. We've reviewed that number now, and we think it can come down slightly. Not by a huge amount, you know. It's not why, because I think we put in 14.7 million at the time as additional. So that will come down slightly. There'll still be a significant increase, but going back to the earlier point about de-risking, following September's report, where things were going globally was energy prices were escalating even higher than that. So effectively, it's bringing down the energy price assumptions back to near where we were in September. Otherwise, we'd have been talking about potentially a much bigger budget gap than we were in September. But yeah, on top of that, the energy prices, our recalibration has reduced those energy prices slightly from the September update. But subject to finalisation with our, as I said, our energy brokers, but that's the current indications that are coming through. I suppose at a point in time in the budget process, we have to draw a line and say that's what we're going with. We accept that there's some degree of confidence levels around that, but there will still be fluctuations through next year. So we'll potentially, so we'll still need to review those. But yeah, energy price assumptions are on the downside, not the upside. In terms of level of ambition, in terms of the in-year position, so we'd set ourselves an initial target of additional management actions of 4 million, but certainly from conversations and discussions that officers are having, we want to push harder than that. In reality, it was an amount. Clearly, the more we can do between now and year end, the more it alleviates the pressure on the reserves position, notwithstanding national government's position about using councils expected to use reserves to cover off some of those cost of living pressures. So I would more than hope, but expect that directorates from discussions, as I say, I'm having, are pushing as hard as they can to bring some of those pressures or to bring that 4 million figure higher so it reduces the overspend position. When we did the Q2 monitoring report, we'd redirected some of the earmarked reserves into unallocated reserves to support the in-year position, so it was about 10 million. So that again is about reprioritising or reviewing what we're holding those earmarked reserves for and reprioritising them. So what we're doing as well is looking at the rest of the earmarked reserves in year to understand how that's going to support the bottom line position as well. Because if the in-year overspend, whatever the in-year overspend comes in at the moment, we've got 47 million of unallocated reserves set aside to support that, but we want to top up or beef up those unallocated reserves rolling into the start of next year as well, because we'll need to use some of those reserves to support next year's position, we think. So you look at it two ways. You look at what opportunities there are within earmarked reserves that are set aside for specific purposes in terms of what we've currently got set aside, and actually reprioritising some of those, as well as looking at our overall unallocated reserves position and what are we prepared, or what is the absolute minimum amount that we're prepared to carry forward. So I did say in the MTFS update report in September that my expectation was that we carry forward a minimum of 47 million unallocated reserves at the start or to support the 23-24 position. So that obviously means that we will be looking at other earmark reserves in year to potentially transfer to unallocated reserves as well, where that opportunity arises. But overall, it does make our overall reserves position tighter, undoubtedly, because we are drawing down reserves in year to support the in-year position, whichever way you look at it. So that has to be factored in for next year as well.
I'm sorry, Ian, but I want to keep it a little simpler than
Okay,
that.
all right.
Because I think the more you've talked, the less I've understood. So in simple terms, in September, we thought we were going to overspend by 34 million, roughly. You anticipated that you would, during the year, have a target reduction of 4 million of that, which meant by the year end, we'd overspend by 30 million. That would have to come out of reserves because there's nowhere else to take it from. So we were projecting that we were going to take 30 million out of reserves this year. Now, are we still projecting that we're going to take 30 million out of reserves this year? Or are we not? And if we're not, either we've now come to the conclusion that we've recalibrated our assumptions and the 34 million overspend is going to come in at less than that, or we've found some money from somewhere else. So we just that one question, that simple, if we can just keep it as tight as that, so I can at least understand that bit, then we'll move on and talk about some other areas, if that's okay. Because I'm trying to understand, we started off with 34 million. What do we currently believe we're going to end up with? Thank you.
Okay, understood. So, I mean, what I said earlier when the question was asked, pretty confident at this stage that we will at least hit the 4 million target that we set as part of Q2 monitoring to bring the position down to 30 million. In terms of, are we going to hit anything on top of that? You're right, we're going to have to take a view. At the moment, we're predicting that the 4 million will be achieved. We haven't predicted yet that there will be anything on top of that, purely because we need to understand what the position is as well in terms of our updated demand forecast going the other way. But that's something that we're actively looking at, but mindful that we'll need to take a position statement on that quite quickly in terms of the budget papers that are going forward. So the current prediction is the 4 million as an absolute minimum.
So on that basis, we are saying we're currently anticipating taking 30 million out of reserves in this current year. And there's nothing else, there's no other management actions that we're doing to reduce that taking 30 million out of reserves.
Well, that's what we're actively looking at the moment. So that's some of the discussions that are ongoing at the moment, just to ascertain the impact of some other measures that could potentially bring that down. So the working assumption is the 4 million. We will be reviewing, or need to review, whether or not there's potential for further on top of that and build that into our plans accordingly. But as I say, there's still, effectively, we've got to second guess what we think the year-end position is, which is what we're looking at.
I'm sorry, Eamon, we've got a month and a half till the year end. So we can't be far off having well, one would hope that we can't be far off having a really good understanding of where we're going to land. Because if you're telling me that a month and a half out, we're really not sure what our year-end position is likely to be, I'm assuming that there are management actions in place and there is monitoring going on, probably on a weekly basis across the directorates. So shall we have a much stronger understanding of our financial position, then we may or may not be drawing down 30 million from reserves in a month, have drawn down 30 million in reserves within the next month and a half to bring, because 31st of March is the end of the year. we? Are you telling me we don't know any more detail than that?
No, we're obviously look at monitoring through the year on a 4-weekly basis, and we're looking at some aspects of those management actions practically on a fortnightly, as we say, in some instances on a weekly basis. All I'm saying is we're confident about the 4 million will be achieved. We are looking at where we think we might be in terms of additional reductions on top of that. All I'm saying is we need to look at that in conjunction with other demand pressures coming through, potentially in the opposite direction. But we will have a view. We will take we're not unsighted in terms of where we're at with the monitoring position, put it that way. It's just how much further we're prepared to push in terms of the year-end position as it stands that we can feel reasonably confident by. And I accept your view that there's only a month and a half to go, but some of the demand-led projections that we're looking at currently, while it's coming up close to the year-end, we just need to be reasonably assured that they're going to stabilise. Because even a couple of months worth, or management information around a few placements, etc., can make a bit of a difference to the bottom line. So, confident about the management actions we're putting in place. It's more the contra impacts of any residual demand pressures coming through that we have to consider as well.
I'm going to bring Councillor Davis in because he's itching to get in.
Yeah, I think, to try and help, absolutely, we're all clear there's going to be a significant burn on our reserves. I think, and I understand, the answers that Eamon's given, because at this point he can't give a precise number, but it is a significant burn. And if we recall, not so long ago, we were having conversations about the fact there were too much reserves, that we should be spending them. Now we are having to, unfortunately, use reserves in line with government expectation, because government have been very clear that councils should be using their reserves to meet some of these demands. However, and I think the point I'm sure you'll be getting to, John, would be, that's not sustainable going forward, and certainly for next financial year, there has to be even more, not accelerate is the wrong word, but certainly, I think tougher is a fair word to say, tougher cost-saving approaches take next year in order to meet our budget gap for next year, and work that we're already doing. However, it is a balance, and certainly for this year, what we've tried to do, and nobody's going to pretend it's perfect, is try and make sure that balance of preserving level of services during an extremely difficult time for our citizens and the support that they need, with cost savings and the additional use of reserves to make sure that we have that balanced budget, and that we've actually set a foundation for the work going forward into next financial year in terms of ensuring there's already initiatives and work taking place that we've built on for next financial year. But yes, there will be a significant burn on reserves, and that puts increased pressure on us for next financial year, and obviously for financial years after that. But the work that's being done at the moment is laying some really good foundations for the increased work that has to be done in terms of cost savings for next financial year.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to express my disappointment, if I'm honest. We've known since September. My expectation would be we'd move much faster and harder, because the longer you allow things to run, in the long term, it has an adverse impact, both on the financial position of the council, but also the financial position of our residents. Because the only way we can recoup our reserves, in reality, is by collecting more council tax. Because that's how, in the long term, we'll pull it back. So if we had, from September, recognised there was a red light flashing here, and taken some of these actions that we're talking about taking now, much quicker, more swifter, if we'd reacted in the same way we reacted as we did during the pandemic, where we pivoted very quickly, our staff were superb at the way in which they adapted and worked in different ways, and even in different directorates almost, But we haven't done that this time. And we've taken far too long. And now we're a month and a half before the year end, and you still can't really tell me exactly how much we think we're going to save this year. And that, for me, is disappointing. And I think, you know, we need to look at why we haven't reacted in the same way as we did during the pandemic, at speed, at pace, taking decisions we need to take. Because, as you said quite rightly, you can only spend reserves once. They take a long time to build up, but they can get spent very, very quickly. So every week that we continue to not take actions means that we're putting more and more reserves at risk. I think Paul wants to come back. He doesn't agree with me.
No, clearly, John, entitled to an opinion, but I'd say that's an opinion. It's certainly not, as far as I'm concerned, one based in fact. There's been a huge amount of work, and certainly in terms of the directorates, they've responded very quickly, and the amount of effort that's been taking place to put together plans which are balanced, which do achieve savings, which do put in place the foundations, as I said, for further savings the next financial year, has certainly been rigorous. I think the other thing I would say, I absolutely agree with you about, you know, once you spend reserves, those reserves are gone. Again, I'll just recall conversations and discussions in the town hall not so long ago when the Conservative Party were telling us that we had far too high a level of reserves and we should be spending it. So can't have it both ways. Can't say a little bit previously you should be spending them and now safeguarding our reserves. And I understand those are political points, but I think both of us are making those political opinions. You're perfectly entitled to
I'm just going to
that.
stop you there, Councillor Davis. This is scrutiny. We don't do politics in scrutiny.
Well, I think, unfortunately, you raised the political point, so I'm responding.
I haven't raised a political point. Sorry, I don't think I have.
Well, we'll agree to disagree, but I believe that your opinion is not one based on fact. It's a political
Well,
point.
that's an opinion of yours, that it's not based on fact. What I've said is that we identified in September that we had a 10% overspend. We put together a target to reduce it by just over 1% in the second half of the year. And I don't think that was ambitious enough. That's not a political point. That is an observation on facts. Eamon, move on to the subsequent year and some questions around that. And again, I'm just trying to get an understanding. So we anticipated that there would be an increase in government support through the financial settlement, which is, you know, sort of quite sensible. And I think you said we anticipated about 2/3 of it. It looked, if I'm reading this right, that we've seen an increase in funding sources of approximately 34 million. So we're talking there about perhaps 10 million of that hadn't been anticipated, rough numbers. So when we talked about a 41 million potential gap or gap for 23-24, does that 10 million bring that down? Or as my colleague rightly pointed out, a lot of the funding that's been provided is in effect dealing with the inflationary impact and wage increases across broadly the social care and health services. So are we saying that once we've understood what the settlement is, that there has been in effect a bonus or a 10 million reduction in that challenge that we're facing? And I'll just leave it at that for the moment. If just tell me whether I read that right or not.
Okay, so it's largely the latter in the sense of the unbudgeted pressures on social care provider sector, and I think that was at the forefront of government's mind as well, with the way that they constructed the funding settlement figures and the way they've come out and the way they've been largely directed on in social care sphere. So they are mindful when they set the national living wage in particular for the following year, and we know we've got a large number of low-paid workers in care provider sector that effectively being paid national living wage, that if if councils don't passport the funding across to that national living wage uplift to the sector, then it puts the system at risk, because there's already, as we know, recruitment issues across that sector and across health as well. So, yeah, I'd say the vast majority of that is supporting those unbudgeted pressures. So it's kind of de-risking some of that pressure. Had we not had those cost of living pressures and those wage pressures, then we wouldn't necessarily have got that level of funding uplift.
So that just leads me to a question around the 41 million projection. Because when we made that projection in September, had we not included within that anticipating increases in
national living
wages? We must have anticipated something, surely.
Yeah, we'd anticipated about on national living wage. We'd anticipated and round about 5% from our previous budget plans in February, and that was probably consistent with what had been predicted, certainly across other councils that I've talked to. But the actual national living wage uplift was 9.7%. That subsequently came through.
So I get that. So the assumptions were built into the 41 million weren't what we got in terms of an outcome, and I get that. But was the full 10 million then? So effectively, the 9 point whatever it is % increase, was that roughly a 20 million cost on our bottom line then?
I think out of that 9.6% uplift, which is about 34 million, about 2/3 of that was already factored into those existing plans. So it's about, as I say, 9 or 10 million that wasn't. So when we finalise our budget plans for 23-24, we'll have extra cost, demand pressure built in to social care side to reflect those unbudgeted pressures and passporting through of things like cost of living pressures or impacted increases in national living wage and an increase in funding. So it'll be a grossing up of unbudgeted pressure and unbudgeted extra funding or the additionality that came through as part of the funding settlement. So it'll be on both sides. So we hadn't factored that in. The September report had the pre-existing assumptions about growth and cost uplift in social care. I think it was about 9 or 10 million we put into the adult side and just under $1 million on the children's side.
So the 41 million, we'd got an assumption in for wage pressures that was roughly half what it came out as.
Yes.
And we had an assumption in for additional demand pressures that again was probably half of what it's currently looking like. Is that right?
It's mainly cost rather than demand. I think that's reflecting where we're at in terms of the actual impact of those unbudgeted pressures. But there is some demand element in there as well.
I'm sorry, I'm probably just not understanding this properly. If we put in a 5% assumption, and it came out 9.7, so we roughly had assumed half of the increase that it's turned out to be. And we got an additional 10 million somewhere, but we're saying that 10 million has been absorbed in that. Is that what was to meet that other half? Is that what we're saying?
Most of that 10 million, that extra 10 million, has been absorbed in terms of the unbudgeted pressures across the social care side. That 10 million also includes the extra 1% council tax uplift assumption as well, which is just over 2 million. Because if you remember, it was that the extra 1% on council tax and the extra 1% on adult social care came through as part of the autumn statement announcement. So we'd predicted 3% uplift in the September report. So it's actually our assumptions, or the officer working assumption now is 5%. So that reflects some of the difference as well.
And then the more recent announcement from the government around support for non-domestic energy suppliers, that presumably isn't in that 41 million either, is it?
No, not yet.
Do we have a view on that?
I think, as I said earlier, we're working with our Yorkshire Purchasing Organisation, Crown Commercial Services, to work through what the model impact of that might be for customers, for non-domestic customers at an individual council level. So we're still waiting for that information to come back to us, which we're expecting next few weeks.
But presumably we had put an assumption in around the increase in energy costs.
Yeah.
So, and now if the government's saying there's going to be support, isn't it not reasonable to align those in some way?
It is subject to getting that information back from as I say, from Crown Commercial Services and Yorkshire Purchasing Organisation. One of the things we need to understand is where they've set the cap. If the prices are reduced anyway, the cap might be higher than the prices we're paying anyway. So it might not actually have any impact. It just provides a buffer if energy prices went in the opposite direction next year, probably due to sort of geopolitical situation, what's happening in Europe.
I get that. I'm trying to understand if the 41 million had included in it an assumption for increased energy costs, and we're now saying a chunk of those are going to either be supported by the government or it's below the cap anyway, so it's going to be less than we were anticipating. It must have an impact on that 41 million. And do we not have a view on that?
Well, as I said earlier, we have updated our energy price assumptions for 23-24 to reflect the scale of increase in energy prices being less than we would have assumed in September. We didn't know at that time what if there'd be any further support for non-domestic customers. We just need to get a view from, as I say, YPO and Crown Commercial Services as to whether or not, or what their expectations are as to that additional support, what it means in practice, if it's going to benefit us or not. Because we're not clear yet, because it depends. If they set the cap at a certain rate, it means, and if our energy prices are at a slightly lower rate, and we've factored those energy prices in to our assumptions, the fact that the cap is at a higher rate, what it does, it gives us some risk mitigation if our energy prices go north of what we'd assumed up to so they'll provide us support at that cap. I don't know yet if it's going to help us any more than we've already assumed in our energy cost updates. It's the nuances of the way that they set the cap for electricity and gas. It's not as simple as it first might look. So we just need to double check that before we'll be prepared to review our energy cost assumptions, but hopefully get some info back in the next couple of weeks.
And I'm guessing as well in that 41 million, we've made assumptions around diesel and petrol prices, which are probably higher than we're now projecting. So again, I'm assuming there's a reduction in that assumption as well.
Yeah, we're looking at that as well as part of the overall, what might our cost inflation requirements need to be for 23-24. I think just the other general comment in all this is that we've said all along the volatility, the environmental external volatility, unable to predict with any certainty for planning purposes on a lot of these issues. So we just need to accept that there's going to have to be some flexibility and fluidity built in at, whatever level we set our budget at straight away, it could change, and we just need to be fleet of foot and understand that whatever measures we put into the budget process captures some of that continuing fluidity, and that we are flexible. We've got enough flexibility built in to accommodate that. This isn't it's never a precise science, even in a business as usual world. This was before all this. It's even less precise. I think that's just the general comment, that we just need to understand when we're trying to set these budgets.
I fully understand that, Eamon. The reason I am asking these questions is obviously, given the scale of the challenge that we're facing, a 1% difference has a huge impact. So I do need to, sort of question and push and make sure we are looking at all of these things, and that's our role as scrutiny, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I fully appreciate that. And believe me, I'm asking the same questions as well. I'm pushing my own colleagues when they come up with the modelling assumptions on absolutely everything. I don't want to push too far in the opposite direction, because I've got to sign off a positive assurance statement in the annual budget report about the reasonableness of the budget estimates. But I can assure you that we are pushing hard on all these assumptions for exactly for the reasons that you've just described.
Thank you. I'm just going to check with my colleagues if anybody else wanted to ask anything else or come in with any other points. I think you've escaped, Eamon. Thank you very much for that. Right, I think we're going to move on to our next item, which is the update on risks. And this links very closely, because obviously, as we've already started to talk about, the link between reserves and corporate risks is really important. So I'm not sure whether Alice or Martin's going to lead on this.
I'll start, Chair, if you like, and then Alice will probably do a bit more in detail. Yeah, so we're sort of here again, as is becoming quite common for us to talk about the risk matrix and risk log. And as I think Eamon has indicated, risk constitutes an important part of understanding where the council's budget and financial position is. So what we've been trying to do, because up until this year, although we've had risk management processes, they've perhaps not been operated in a completely integrated and effective way. So since we employed my colleague here earlier last year, we've been looking to try to tighten up our process and make the process rather more systematic and I won't say mechanistic, that would be insulting, and make it more understanding of exactly how the organisation works. So that's what we've been working on for sort of the best part of 9 months now, and I think we're getting to the point where we have got a much more robust system. And whilst it hasn't massively changed, the information that it's generating is more linked in, and we still have to get a bit more of the organisation to accept the culture of sharing some of the risks that they perceive, or managers perceive, so that we can sort of report those and assess how strong those risks are, because sometimes people can have a completely wrong perception of how strong or severe a risk is, or equally sometimes the complete reverse and something which you aren't expecting. So no risk management system can be perfect. And one of the things that we have particularly worked on, and this is the sort of main products that's new for this particular, or feature that's new for this particular meeting, is the risk map form, which I think you should have in your pack, which is the document which shows the risks. Now, it actually only shows those risks that are in the red or orange areas where there is considered to be a fairly large exposure. And the very nature of this is that, if you tried to put every risk the council ever faced, it would be a document so large or so unreadable because of the minimal size of the text that you could fit in. There are multiple risks that this organisation faces. The vast majority of them it manages well because it knows how to do it, it understands it, and it progresses them. But these are the ones which are exposed, so that those charged with governance, the senior management team of the council and the cabinet essentially, but the whole council in another context, have to take responsibility for and understand. And it won't come as a huge surprise that the risks that appear on this document, which are detailed in rather more detail in the cover sheet, which goes with it, the one which just has red and yellow splodges on it, are the core risks that this organisation faces. I think you'll be well aware of many of them. And actually, they've all been mentioned. The ones that are at the top in the most highest risk box have already been mentioned today, because we've talked about the council's need for sustainable finances and community wellbeing, which was mentioned by Councillor McCarthy, I think, and particularly Councillor Hawkins, in the context of people's understanding. And then the wider issues of workforce development and understanding that our workforce gets the issues, and also the fact that things like the current financial position means that, or the current recruitment position is also potentially a problem. So these are the sort of risks as now identified. It's also showing that, I think, with a bit more assertion, areas like safeguarding have perhaps moved slightly down, but are still there, are sitting there, as something which those charged with governance have to remember. Also sitting in there are things like climate change, compliance with our statutory obligations, and ultimate effective governance, and then one or two other issues around risk, about the management of fixed assets and physical assets and operational resilience. So that's the sort of main areas that we've been working on. And what we've also tried to do is learning from comments that have been made to us, particularly over the last 6 to 8 months, 10 months, is also to sort of create more of a trail about how things are moving, so that we can see which risks are rising and which are falling. The new corporate risk matrix is actually the same material but presented in a marginally different way. So, but it very clearly shows what the core issues are in a more overt and systematic way than we had previously. I think that's where we are on the core documents, and then we will talk about the emerging risks in private session if members wish to do so. I don't know if there's anything Alice feels we need to add into that, Chair, if that's okay.
The only thing I'd add is that on the risk heat map, this is the first time that this has been produced, so going forward we'll be able to show direction of travel on there, so we'll expect to see where risks have moved. So that's the aim of that. And I also just say that our focus going forward is very much on the mitigating actions and controls that are in place against the risks. So I think we are generally very good as an organisation of recognising and identifying what risks we face. And I'm just working with my counterparts to making sure we're robustly evidencing and documenting the actions that we're taking, because generally, they're there. We just need to make sure that we are documenting them clearly.
Can I thank you both for that? And I think this heat map is really, really effective. So well done for doing it. And I get the point about showing the direction of travel. That'll be, because we need to look at the subsequent document really to get that, don't we? I will bring colleagues in a moment, but if on this one, if I may first, and it follows on quite nicely from our previous discussion around reserves. So what this doesn't do at the moment is give us a financial sort of aspect to it. And what I'd hope to see us moving towards is where we can start to get a view on the potential financial impact of these. Because what I'd love to be able to see is that clear alignment. So when we have been talking about using our reserves to meet funding gaps, having an understanding of what the minimum we need to retain because of the risks that as an organisation we face, for me is critical, because otherwise we're heavily reliant on Eamon getting the number right at the moment, aren't we? Which is a huge pressure on him personally, particularly as he has to, as you said, Eamon, sign off that certificate of, can't remember what we call it, but section 151, isn't it?
Yeah, positive assurance statement.
Thank you. That's where. And is that something that we're starting to think about or move towards? If I can just start with that question.
Yes, Chair. It's interesting that Alice and I had this conversation. Was it last week about how you can make this scientific, or more scientific? And I think the problem is it is always going to be slightly pseudo-scientific, because that a risk crystallises its out if it's at its complete and absolute cost, or the maximum, is very unlikely. Things tend to have a sort of the things that are most likely to happen will tend to have a relatively low cost, etc., etc. And so, and indeed, something which could happen in a selection of different ways is much more likely to have it's like the pandemic was an example of something that was unusual in the sense that it involved a lot of people and was quite severe. You often find things where people like ailments where you will get a lot of people catching a common cold that doesn't do much harm, and very few people catch the most obnoxious or horrible diseases. And much is the same in relation to your financial exposure, and when you face risk, I think we discussed the chance of this place burning down in its entirety is a very low. That's the town hall, is very low, but the impact of it, if it did happen, would be very, very, very severe. The chance of a small fire taking place here is probably somewhat higher, but the chances of it doing more than perhaps £250,000 worth of damage are quite low. So it's doing that assessment and then trying to do it for all the multiple cases and case studies and issues and areas of risk that we face. So it's getting that balance right. I think we are going to try to do it, but to some extent it is also, there's still going to be a degree of dependence on the judgments of the Chief Finance Officer and the use of general metrics that are considered to be adequate, like, is it 5% that the external auditors expect to see as an absolute minimum and as a sort of balance? It's something like that, I think the figure you were mentioning the other day.
Yeah, in terms of unallocated reserves.
Bring Gary in, because Gary's indicated he'd like to ask a question.
Thank you, Chair. My question is essentially on the team that put this together, because these kind of tools are very common in risk assessments to do with health and safety, engineering projects and that kind of thing. But the key to these is often the breadth and the depth of knowledge that goes into it. Was the team that did this actually quite a broad team and cross-functional? Or was it kind of a more narrow team? It's just a question to understand the process, how this came about. Thank you.
Yes, the council has a so-called risk panel that is meant to be multifunctional, but it's of medium-level officers, and then the documentation is drawn up by us two, and then Alice has conversations with specific people who are often at a slightly higher level in the organisation about how those risks might manifest. And then the process goes through executive team and through LMT, the cabinet group. So there's a sort of degree of there's a degree of processing and checking, but you're absolutely right that these things depend on the quality of what goes in. So, and some of it is the integration of things that come from across the council. So, for example, workforce matters might be raised by selections of management teams in operational areas and HR, and we bring that together and consolidate it. So that's the methodology we use to sort of create this document. Sometimes it's coming from in-house specialist experts like health and safety. Sometimes it's coming from from service-specific areas. So that's the sort of methodology that we use to create it. So yes. Hopefully that answers your question. Don't know if there's anything Alice wants to add.
Gary, did you want to come back?
No, thank you. That's a good answer. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Okay, colleagues.
Thanks, John. And yeah, I also appreciate the heat map sort of layout of this, which I've seen, in work outside the council as well. I think it's a very clear way of showing the levels of risk we're facing. In considering, when I was thinking about this and all the various kind of longer term risks that the council faces for, achieving our goals, one area that came to me that isn't really addressed here so far is about, I suppose, the transport infrastructure, the transport network, which is a multifaceted issue, because obviously we have some ownership in this with highways, with public rights of way, and so on. The combined authority has ownership of much of the transport infrastructure. Of course, we have private sector operators as well. As a council, we are usually the key partner in delivering many of the transport improvement schemes and so on. I do feel there is risk in potential failure on delivering these or prioritising these kinds of improvements for sustainable growth goals and climate change goals. And I think it is a fairly long-term issue, the attractiveness, or can I put it, unattractiveness that many residents feel towards the public transport and active travel facilities within the district. And I know there's been quite widespread discontent about this for some time, and that things feel like they're moving in maybe more sideways, or some things move forward, but then it's 2 steps back at the same time. Whereas this area isn't really covered at all in, these in the risk matrix currently. So I do think there is potentially some scope to include that. I was wondering if it's something that had been considered before, if it's something that could be considered to include. Thank you.
I think it's fair to say that the things you've mentioned, or at least the parts that relate to the council, do appear in the service and directorate risk log. So if we brought you highways and transportation's risk log, we would have found almost all the things that you've mentioned. Also, in some of the major project risk logs, some of the other issues that you describe, particularly the sort of high WICA-funded highways projects, appear in there. And I think, as Eamon's also mentioned, the compromise about the issue around funding for those projects, because they are the particularly expensive ones that Eamon pointed out earlier, that WICA have tended to want us to make a contribution to, or us to take the risk share on, are being challenged. So those type of things certainly appear in the things that we take knowledge of and understand. I think that perhaps the issues around the council's budget challenge back to WICA has been listed it's been listed in a slightly more generic way in some of the risk information that's been shown before. I think probably in the next update of the risk log, and this is partly covered off in the private part as well, we'll probably have a slightly more robust statement about that particular area, because that's become more obvious since we prepared the current documents, which you've got a couple of months ago. So I think that you're absolutely right. It's when it's coming from multifunctions, though, because a lot of the criticism is about public transport, which is sort of controlled by, as you say, by private operators and by WICA. But I do get what you say about, from a community point of view, that the sort of transport links between the bits that are purely the council's responsibility and those where they are a partial enabler is a risk area. But it's more in a sort of policy and political rather than a pure financial risk, I think.
I think that's one of the challenges. What do you show on this, and this is corporate risks, and you could probably bring 100, couldn't you, also? But then you start to lose the ability to see the wood for the trees, so to speak.
Your mic's just gone off for me, John, sorry. Your microphone's just gone off. I can't hear you. It's not ready to show up, mate.
Sorry.
Got
Apologies, but thank you for pointing that out, Councillor Hawkins. We now come to the end of the public agenda. We will be going into private session. We're going to private session because the information that we're going to talk about from a risk perspective is confidential, hence the reason for the private session. But I'd like to thank anybody who has been watching online. And of course, this will be available to play back at a future date. Thank you.